In the last section, we were able to make a successful request over to the Unsplash API using Axios anytime that a user entered a search term and then submitted the form. So now we need to somehow figure out how we can get the data that is returned from this request and use it to show a list of images on the screen. The entire flow or the process for implementing this is going to be very similar to the series of steps that we went through on a previous application when we used that geolocation API. So let's have a quick discussion on how we're going to do this. All right, so here's what's going to happen in a time series. We first start out by rendering our application. The app component is going to render itself one time without any images. Remember, when we first load our application, we have no images whatsoever. It's only when a user enters a search term and then hits enter that our onSearchSubmit method gets called and we make an actual request over to Unsplash. When we make that request over to Unsplash, it's going to take some amount of time to get a response from that API. So we're going to essentially, more or less, sit around and wait for a response. When we finally get a response, we then want to use that image data to update what our app component is showing. In order to get our app component to re-render, we're going to call setState on it and set our images as state on the app component. That will cause the app component to re-render, and we can use that as an opportunity to then show a list of images. Now, as a quick reminder, I'm saying have our app component show the images. Well, in the original plan we put together, we had said that we would make a new component called ImageList that would be responsible for showing the list of images. So we're not going to have app show the images itself. With that in mind, for right now, let's set a more immediate or short-term goal and just say that we want the app to print out the number of images that were fetched. I think that would be a good short-term goal. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is find our onSearchSubmit method right here, and we need to somehow write some code inside of here to get a notice or a notification or a tap on the shoulder when this request is complete. Remember, this network request is an asynchronous request. It will take some amount of time for Axios to reach out to Unsplash and then get a response back. By the time we get a response from this request, we will have already exited the onSearchSubmit method. Now, in order to get a little notification of when the request is completed, we have two different options. There's one option that you're going to see in a lot of documentation that's a little bit more challenging, and another option that's a little bit newer, but way, way, way easier to write out in code. Now, I'm going to show you both methods so you understand them very simply. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is find the Axios call, and then on the very end of the Axios call, I'm going to remove that semicolon right there. Whenever we make a request with Axios, it returns an object called a promise. A promise is an object that will essentially give us a little notification when some amount of work, like a network request, is completed. In order to get a little tap on the shoulder when the request is completed, we chain on a .then function like so. This .then function is going to be called at some point in the future, or excuse me, we pass to the .then a function, usually an arrow function like so, and this arrow function will be called at some point in the future. That's much better. So this little arrow function we're putting in right there is essentially a callback that will be invoked with whatever data that we got back from the Unsplash API. For right now, let's refer to that data as a response, and we'll just console log that response and just see what happens for now. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and we'll run this code and see what happens. So back over in my application, I'm going to open up my console. I'll search for cars again, and here's the console log that we just got out of that .then statement. So it looks like the response we get back has a lot of different properties attached to it. We get the status text, a status code, 200 means that the request was successful. We see some config around the request that was made, data around the request itself, but all this stuff is totally irrelevant. The thing we really care about is this data property right here, and more precisely, the results property. So response.data.results contains the list of images that we care about. With that in mind, let's update the console log one more time and make sure that we can just directly access that list of images. So I will say response.data. Was it results? Yeah, results. And then I'll save this again. Okay, so our console was reset because the page reloaded. I'll throw in cars a second time, and now we see that we get this nice console log of an array of objects, and each object represents one distinct image. Okay, so that's how we get access to that list of images by using this approach right here of chaining on a .then statement. So this is the first method that's a little bit harder to use anytime that we want to get a response from some asynchronous request. You can always use this .then statement anytime that you know that you are working with a promise. So let's now take a look at the alternate method. Like I said, this alternate method for getting a little notification of when we get this response back is a little bit easier to write out. All right, so I'm going to remove the .then statement. I'm going to find my onSearchSubmit function, and I'm going to mark it with the async keyword like so. By putting the async keyword in front of the function name, that allows us to use the async await syntax inside this function. What that really means is that in front of the network request that we make to Axios right there, I'm going to put the await keyword. And then in front of that, I'm going to assign a new variable called response like so. So in total, I have const response equals await Axios. And then down here, after that entire request, I can console log out response.data.results, like so. All right, before I tell you anything about this syntax right here, let's save the file and then run it again very quickly. So I'll put in a search term of cars and hit enter, and I see again, I get my array of results right here, just as we did previously. So we have the promise-based syntax that uses a .then statement that will be called anytime the request gets completed. Alternatively, we can use this async await syntax. In my opinion, async await is far easier to understand and to write out in code than making use of the promise. When you want to use the async await syntax, you just put that async keyword in front of the method name. You find whatever is returning or whatever is taking some time to resolve. In this case, it is the network request with axios.get, and we put the await keyword in front of that. And then whatever gets returned from this entire statement right here, we will assign to some variable as we usually do, and then we can freely work with that variable later on. We're going to be using this async await syntax many times throughout this course, so we'll get a lot of practice with it and some practice with some variations that add in some pretty good error handling with it as well. All right, so we now are able to get our list of images here. Let's take a quick pause. When we come back to the next section, we're going to update our app component to have a state property and make sure that we set our list of images on that state. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.